Gerald Parker was born in 1955 and grew up in San Diego, California. According to his own accounts, his life was unstable from the very start. One of the key aspects of Parker's early life is his exposure to substance abuse. Parker told investigators that he began sniffing glue and paint thinner around 7. And by the time he was in junior high school in San Diego, he was already experimenting with LSD and mescaline. Additionally, Parker stated that he had always had difficulty forming relationships with women and had never developed meaningful romantic connections with them. He described this not as something that developed over time, but as a characteristic that was present for as long as he could remember. Whether that isolation was a cause or a symptom of his deeper dysfunction is unclear, but it would be a major component leading to his eventual violence. In the early 1970s, Parker enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, ultimately serving 7 years, stationed at multiple bases across the country. Surprisingly, despite his early exposure to substance use, it was only after serving about 4 to 5 years in the military that he first consumed alcohol. It was also around this time that he was assigned to an air station in Orange County, California. His shift started from around 4:30 p.m. all the way into 8 a.m. the following morning. Parker was regarded by his peers and superiors as a model Marine, but when off-duty and alone, he was almost entirely consumed by alcohol, substances, and an escalating habit of watching women through windows. By the late 1970s, Parker was drinking what he described as a daily case of beer plus approximately half a fifth of hard liquor. He had used LSD approximately 1,000 times by his own estimate. He also used PCP regularly and combined other substances to create what are called speedballs. Eventually, his substance abuse had deteriorated to the point that he was frequently failing to report for duty, and he was approaching a point of discharge from the Marine Corps. In later statements, Parker told detectives that his first thought about assaulting women arose in December 1978. He would regularly get drunk at bars, then drive around Orange County at night looking for women. When he could not find or could not afford anyone, his attention shifted to apartment complexes. Parker parked his black van nearby, sometimes jogged through neighborhoods to survey the area without attracting attention, and watched for women who were alone. On December 1st in Anaheim, Parker encountered 17-year-old Sandra K. Fry, who shared an apartment with her roommate Georgina Stevenson. Parker first noticed Fry through her window sitting at the kitchen table. He moved to the back of the apartment and found the window to her roommate's bedroom open. Parker climbed through it, and once inside, he observed Fry for several more minutes before striking her from behind. He attempted to knock her unconscious in a single blow, but failed and a struggle ensued. Fry ended up with bruises all over her arms, neck, and body. She sustained at least 3 blows to her head before being knocked unconscious. Parker then dragged her into the bedroom and assaulted her. Before leaving, Parker noted that Fry appeared to be struggling to breathe. When Stevenson came home around 11 p.m., she found Fry lying unresponsive across her bed, nude from the waist down. There was blood around her mouth, nose, and hair. Fry was still warm to the touch, but was not breathing. Paramedics transported her to the hospital, where she was ultimately pronounced dead. The cause of death was hemorrhaging caused by cerebral lacerations and skull fractures. Investigators later discovered a fingerprint as well as from the crime scene and the victim, but these would not prove to be useful until decades later. 4 months after Fry's death, Parker struck again. The second attack took place on the night of March 31st, 1979 in a 1-bedroom apartment in Costa Mesa shared by 21-year-old Kimberly Gay Rollins and her roommate Roberta Biratella. That evening, Biratella and a friend named Donna Chavez had each gone out on dates around 7:30 p.m., leaving Rollins alone in the apartment. Chavez and her date returned around 11:30 p.m. to pick up Chavez's ID. They spoke briefly with Rollins before leaving again sometime after midnight. As they left, Rollins asked them not to lock the front door on their way out. Biratella didn't have a key, and Rollins was going to shower and go to sleep. Meanwhile, Parker had been standing near a window listening to 3 people talking inside. He watched the man and one of the women leave, confirming that Rollins was now alone. Rather than entering immediately, he drove around for approximately 1 hour before returning. After confirming once more that the woman was alone, he walked through the unlocked front door. The lights in the apartment were off and Rollins was asleep in the bedroom. He struck her 3 times with the 2x4 he was carrying and assaulted her. He left through the same front door, throwing the 2x4 onto the garage roof on his way out. Interestingly, Parker claims that during several, if not all, of his assaults, he was in a trance-like blackout state as a result of excessive alcohol and substance consumption. Due to this, he sometimes could not remember if he actually assaulted some of his victims. However, DNA later discovered on Rollins' body would confirm that he did. Biratella came home around 4:45 a.m. to find the front door of the apartment ajar and all the lights off, except the one in the bathroom. She heard a sound from the bedroom, what she described as a heavy sigh or a forced breath, and went in. Rollins was lying half off the bed, wearing only an open bathrobe. Both of her eyes were blackened. There was froth in her nostrils, and the area above both ears was severely swollen. Biratella, believing Rollins was dead and terrified that whoever had done it might still be in the apartment, fled to a neighbor's home to call the police. Officers who responded to the scene detected a faint pulse and began CPR. Paramedics arrived and continued their efforts, but Rollins was pronounced dead at the scene. On the night of September 14th, about 5 months after Rollins' murder, Parker found his next target. She was a 31-year-old woman named Marilyn K. Carlton living in a first-floor apartment in Costa Mesa. Carlton lived with her 9-year-old son, Joey. Parker described scaling a back wall and entering Carlton's apartment through an unlocked sliding glass door. She was asleep in her bed wearing a nightgown. He hit her in the head several times, claiming that he couldn't remember what object he used in this particular attack. He attempted to assault her, but recalled that he might have been suffering from ED at the time. He then exited the bedroom, and in the darkened hallway, he walked directly into Joey. The boy stared and asked if there was something wrong with his mom. Parker said nothing, moved the child aside, and left the apartment through the same sliding door he had entered. At approximately 11:45 p.m. before the attack, the complex's property manager, who lived in the unit directly next door, walked past and noticed that Carlton's patio sliding door and drapes were open, but the screen was closed. The light was on in the dining area, and the manager could see Carlton, who appeared to be asleep on the floor. The manager did not attempt to check on what was happening. Shortly before 3 a.m., an officer was dispatched to the apartment. Upon arrival, Joey told the officer that his mother had been hurt. The apartment was dark except for a light in the hallway. Carlton was found on the master bedroom floor, partially propped up against her bed and nightstand. She had a very weak pulse and was struggling to breathe. Her face and hair were covered with blood, and there was a large wound across the top of her skull. Paramedics transported her to the hospital, where she died the following day. 2 weeks later, another murder was committed. On the night of September 30th, he targeted a ground floor apartment in Tustin, where 20-year-old Diana Green lived with her husband, Kevin, a Marine corporal. Diana was 9 months pregnant at the time. Parker described arriving drunk at the apartment complex sometime around midnight and parking nearby. While walking around the complex, he overheard the couple arguing inside the apartment. He then heard a car start up and watched Kevin drive away. Rather than entering immediately, Parker left, drank more alcohol for approximately 1 hour, and returned. He then entered through the unlocked front door. Inside the living room, he noticed various items indicating the husband was in the Marines. Diana was lying on the bed in the bedroom. Carrying a board that he had found outside, Parker rushed toward Diana and slammed the board against her head. The blow left a 2-inch hole in the center of her forehead. She was assaulted, and Parker left through the front door. When Kevin returned to the apartment, he found Diana unconscious on the bed. Law enforcement officers responded to the scene at approximately 2:15 a.m. and were met outside by Kevin, who appeared to be in a state of shock. Inside the bedroom, officers found Diana lying on the bed, bleeding from her head, ears, and nose. There was also blood on the bed and floor, and blood spatter on the wall behind the bed. When officials examined the injury to her head, they initially believed that she had been shot. Diana was transported to the hospital, but several hours after her admission, her unborn daughter ceased to have vital signs and was delivered stillborn. The official cause of death was labeled intrauterine anoxia. The infant was named Chantal Marie Green. Diana survived but spent 10 days in a coma and remained hospitalized for approximately 3 weeks. When she regained consciousness, she had total amnesia. She did not recognize anyone. She had to relearn to speak and to spell, a process that took years. About a week later, Parker took his 5th victim. On October 6th, he targeted another apartment in Tustin where 24-year-old Deborah Kennedy lived with her sister, Yvette LeVay. That evening, LeVay and a friend had left for a trip to Las Vegas around 9 p.m., leaving Kennedy home alone. When Parker was surveying that night, he found a mallet in the back of a pickup truck near the complex. After taking it, he entered Kennedy's apartment via a window left slightly ajar at the back of the building. He removed the screen and stepped into the living room to find Kennedy asleep on the floor, leaning against the couch with the TV on and a blanket over her. He struck her in the head with the mallet, violated her, and left. LeVay returned to the apartment the following day around 6 p.m. She found the front door open and Kennedy lying in her bedroom in an exaggerated spread eagle position on a blood-soaked mattress that had been placed on the floor. She had sustained massive blunt force trauma to her face and showed no signs of life. Her body had been partially covered with a knitted shawl. The 6th and final murder occurred 2 weeks later in Costa Mesa. The victim was 17-year-old Deborah Lynn Sr., who was sharing an apartment with a friend. That evening, the two had attended a party in Fountain Valley together. Around 10:30 p.m., Sr. left the party alone in her roommate's car to go back to the apartment. The roommate agreed to arrange her own ride later on once she was ready to leave. Parker described parking a considerable distance from the apartment that night and pretending to be a jogger as he moved through the neighborhood, scanning windows. He saw that Senior's apartment was empty and entered through a bathroom window, pulling himself up by using the gas meter on the outside wall as a foothold. He had been inside the apartment for approximately 20 minutes before Senior came home. Up to that point, Parker had remained hidden within the bathroom. He was able to peer through to see Senior making herself a drink in the kitchen before sitting down on the couch in the living room. Parker waited for her to fall asleep, and when she did, he struck her in the head several times, rendering her unconscious. He then carried her into one of the bedrooms and violated her. When the roommate arrived home around 2:30 a.m., the lights in the apartment were on and the stereo was playing. She found Senior lying on the floor of her bedroom near the foot of the bed. Her hair was matted with blood and she had suffered severe head trauma. From here, the attack stopped as media and police attention had grown significantly. Locals had even dubbed the culprit behind the assaults as the bedroom basher. Furthermore, a composite sketch of a man described to have a dark complexion with thick, curly black hair and a mustache was making its rounds. The sketch originally came from the Costa Mesa Police Department, the same city where 3 of Parker's victims were attacked. In an interesting turn of events, instead of catching the true culprit in the case of Diana Green, her husband, Kevin, became the prime suspect. Back on the night of the attack, he told officers he had gone out to get something to eat. He gave a consistent account of his movements, stating that he and Diana had argued and he left around 1:30 a.m. to get something to eat at a Jack in the Box restaurant, returned and found her unconscious, and called for help. He told investigators he had noticed a black man loitering near the apartment complex when he returned. His food was reportedly still warm when police arrived, corroborating his account. And a Jack in the Box employee would later testify that Kevin had indeed been at the restaurant that night and purchased a hamburger. There was no physical evidence directly connecting Kevin to the attack, and no murder weapon was found. There were also no fingerprints linking Kevin to anything unusual in the apartment. The assault kit taken from Diana at the hospital preserved biological evidence, but no DNA analysis technology capable of producing an identification from that sample existed in 1979. What did exist was the deeply traumatic experience of Diana herself, and eventually her memory of what she believed had happened. Approximately 3 months after waking from her coma, Diana told investigators that her memory had returned. The trigger was apparently a baby magazine that she was reading. Her account of the events on the night of the assault was that Kevin had demanded sex from her. She refused, telling him she was 9 months pregnant, and Kevin became angry. He struck her in the head with a key retractor and a ring of keys during the argument that followed. She said the couple argued often and that Kevin had complained to friends that the two no longer engaged in intimacy after entering her 8th month of pregnancy. In April 1980, Kevin Green was formally charged with second-degree murder of his child and the attempted murder and assault of Diana. He was 22 years old and still a Marine corporal at the time of his arrest, though his military status was soon effectively terminated. The investigation that preceded the charge was described as narrow. At that point, several murders had occurred and law enforcement was desperate for an arrest. The two murders of Kennedy and Sr. had occurred while Kevin was already in custody and under investigation. Despite holding similar details to the previous bedroom basher crimes, investigators refused to revisit the question of whether or not they had the right suspect. Despite being charged in April 1980, Kevin did not go to trial until a decade later in September 1990. Kevin denied committing the crime, but the jury was not persuaded. On October 1st, 1990, he was found guilty and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He was 32 years old at the time of sentencing. Because he denied committing the crimes at every single parole hearing, his requests for parole were denied. In prison, however, Kevin did not collapse into bitterness or dysfunction. He was described by many as a model inmate. He even coordinated the prison Christmas party at one facility. He maintained correspondence and phone contact with Tina Marie Hunger, his first wife, who never doubted him and told reporters that anyone who truly knew Kevin understood it was impossible for him to have done what he was convicted of. He also had a daughter, Desiree Sunshine, from his relationship with Hunger, apparently born while he was imprisoned, who grew up knowing her father was innocent and staying with Kevin's parents, Frank and Sharon, in the Midwest. Kevin married a third time in 1985 while incarcerated to a woman named Darlene. In June 1996, while staff at the Orange County Crime Lab were in the process of uploading thousands of convicted offender DNA profiles, the system returned multiple simultaneous matches. Every bedroom basher crime scene linked to a single individual in the database named Gerald Parker, then 40 years old and currently incarcerated at Avenel State Prison on a parole violation stemming from the assault of a 13-year-old girl. Detectives from various departments drove to Avenel State Prison on June 14, 1996, to confront Parker with the evidence. Parker deflected and minimized the questioning throughout the early part of the interrogation. Then he asked to use the restroom, and upon his return, he began to talk freely. He gave a detailed confession to all 6 attacks, walking investigators through each crime scene from memory. He described his nightly routines, how he selected targets, what he used as weapons, and how he entered the homes. He even told them he believed there was a man incarcerated because of something he had done, and that out of everything he had committed over the years, that was the case that had troubled him most. It was after this confession that officials went back to the DNA evidence obtained via Diana Green's assault kit and confirmed that it was a match to Gerald Parker, not to Kevin Green. 6 days after the confession, on June 20th, 1996, Judge Robert Fitzgerald vacated Kevin Green's convictions and dismissed all charges against him. Kevin walked out of prison after 16 years of wrongful confinement from the time he was initially arrested and imprisoned. In August 1996, Parker appeared before a grand jury and repeated his confessions in detail. The Orange County District Attorney's Office announced it would seek the death penalty. His criminal trial for the 6 murders began in the fall of 1998, and he did not contest that he was the attacker. However, he claimed he had no idea the women were dying from his blows, comparing the attacks to a previous incident in which he had knocked someone unconscious with a 2x4 without killing them. The jury was not persuaded. After deliberating for just over 2 hours, it returned a guilty verdict on all 6 counts of first-degree murder on October 20th, 1998, almost exactly 19 years after his final killing. On January 21st, 1999, Judge Francisco P. Brezzano sentenced Gerald Parker to death. In March 1997, the state of California awarded Kevin Green $10,000 under the compensation statute available at the time for wrongfully convicted persons. This amount, which was the max for such claims, was widely regarded as grossly inadequate given the amount of time served. Advocates and legislators immediately began pushing for a larger settlement. In October 1999, California Governor Gray Davis signed a special bill awarding Kevin an additional $620,000. This amount worked out to roughly $39,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment. Around the same time, Kevin faced a separate legal complication. Diana had filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against him, arguing that a prior physical altercation between the couple the night of the attack had left her in a semi-conscious state before Parker even entered the apartment, thereby making Kevin partly responsible for what happened. Kevin settled the lawsuit in December 1999 on undisclosed terms. No criminal liability was attached to the settlement. Kevin rebuilt his life after exoneration and has spoken publicly about the criminal justice system, wrongful convictions, and the failures that contributed to his imprisonment. His ex-wife eventually issued a public apology to Kevin for the mistaken accusation. As for Gerald Parker, he has not yet been executed and is incarcerated at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center on death row. Bevan Spencer von Einem was born on May 29, 1946 in Adelaide, Australia. Details on his childhood are sparse, but he was said to have an immensely close relationship with his mother. Additionally, Bevan's hair began to gray prematurely while he was still around 15, which became a point he was self-conscious about. By 1964, Bevan had completed his education at around 18 and was preparing to enter the workforce. He began bookkeeping training and was able to land a job by 1965. This bookkeeping job was at a company later known as Pipeline Supplies, located in northern Adelaide. The position was fairly standard, and it would turn out to be the only long-term employer of his adult working life. By the time he hit his early 20s, Bevan discovered that he was gay and began frequenting unofficial meeting places referred to as beats. At the time, homosexual acts were actually regarded as crimes, and these beats were often patrolled by police. In 1972, Bevan's father died, which marked a major shift in which he and his mother began moving house to house together. Bevan remained closeted and maintained his double life despite having his mother right by his side. Now, an interesting event that Bevan isn't exactly directly involved in but would become key later occurred in March 1972. On March 25th, a 41-year-old British man named Dr. George Duncan arrived in Adelaide after getting off a flight from the UK. He had relocated from Bristol to take up a lecturing job in Roman law and English legal history at the University of Adelaide Law School. Duncan was a shy, introverted gay man and was used to expressing that side of him somewhat openly when he still resided in the UK. On the night of Wednesday, May 10th, 1972, Duncan went to the southern bank of the River Torrens, which was known as the most popular beat. He was joined there by Roger James, a local man, and at least one other unidentified man. Also present nearby was a witness named Julian Clark, who was himself assaulted that night and who would eventually, 16 years later, provide a detailed police statement about what he saw. Just after 11 p.m., a group of men converged on Duncan and James. According to witness accounts, the attackers beat both men. Julian Clark would tell police in 1988 that he had heard screaming, saw two men thrown into the river by a group, and that he himself was punched and told to F off before he too was flung into the water. Clark separately told another witness that the attackers were actually police officers. James suffered a broken ankle when he was thrown from the steep southern bank into the water. Duncan, unable to swim, sank beneath the surface of the Torrens almost immediately. One of his attackers, realizing what was happening, reportedly dived into the water in an attempt to save him. Unable to locate Duncan, the attackers then fled the scene. James, injured but conscious, dragged himself out of the river and up to the road above, where he lay unable to walk. It was at this moment that Bevan, now aged 25, entered the story. Driving past the riverbank, he saw James lying injured by the roadside. Bevan stopped, helped the injured man off the road, and loaded him into his vehicle. He then drove James directly to the Royal Adelaide Hospital on North Terrace, where James was admitted for treatment of his broken ankle. Several hours later, the body of Duncan was retrieved from the Torrens by police. On a messed up side note, a television news cameraman was said to have arrived late to the scene after officials had already recovered Duncan from the river and requested that he be placed back under the water so that he could be filmed being pulled out. In the days that followed Duncan's death, rumors swept Adelaide that the attackers had been Vice Squad officers, the same unit whose routine operations targeted gay men at the Torrens beat. Witnesses at or near the scene later reported that the 3 detectives identified as suspects were accompanied that night by a tall, unidentified male civilian. Roger James, traumatized and fearing for his life, declined to identify his attackers. Premier Don Dunstan, who was driving the state's rapid social reform agenda, publicly offered government witness protection arrangements to anyone willing to speak about the incident. The offer produced little, partly because many of those with knowledge of the events were gay themselves and feared prosecution under existing laws. Years later, Bevan would claim that 2 police officers had threatened his life if he testified at the Duncan investigation. 2 of the 3 police officers were later identified, but they refused to answer questions. Their refusal led to their suspension from duty and ultimately their resignation from the South Australian Police. A 3rd officer had already left the force before the investigation concluded. The incident was framed internally by police as, quote, a high-spirited frolic that had gone wrong. No charges were filed at the stage, and the matter passed from the courts into a long limbo that would not be formally reopened until the mid-1980s. Public outrage over Duncan's death had immediate and far-reaching political consequences. Within weeks of Duncan's drowning, Premier Dunstan's Labour government introduced the first of several legislative attempts to decriminalize existing laws. In 1975, 3 years later, South Australia would become the first Australian state to fully decriminalize male homosexuality. For Bevan personally, his name was now in police files and hospital records associated with a high-profile homicide case via his rescue of Roger James. Those records would sit dormant for over a decade. The next key incidents begin in 1979 and involve a disturbing series of incidents that would later be grouped under the label The Family. These were moments where a victim was sedated, suffered major anorectal trauma from blunt objects, and was disposed of in water. Sometimes these victims were also subjected to post-mortem dissection. Bevan would later be found to have been directly involved in at least one of the crimes tied to the family network. The first incident occurred around mid-June 1979 and involved 17-year-old Alan Barnes. Barnes had spent the night of Saturday, June 16th at the home of his friend Darko Castellan and spent Sunday evening visiting another friend. Castellan had initially planned to accompany Barnes back but changed his mind and stayed home. As a result, Barnes set out alone to hitchhike back to his family's home. Witnesses who came forward later reported seeing a young man matching Barnes's description climbing into a white Holden HQ sedan with 3 or 4 occupants along Grand Junction Road. When Barnes failed to return home, his mother reported him missing on Monday, June 18th. About a week after he disappeared, a pair of hikers in the Adelaide foothills northeast of the city came across Barnes's body beneath an old bridge at the South Para Reservoir. Investigators interpreted the scene as a botched disposal. The reservoir's water level was lower than the killers had apparently anticipated, and rather than landing in the water below, Barnes's corpse had fallen onto dry ground, contorted in an unnatural way. His body had been washed post-mortem and redressed in different clothing. The autopsy documented extensive beatings and torture in addition to the fatal anal trauma, and confirmed both alcohol and cked in Barnes's system. Police opened a homicide investigation under investigator Rod Hunter and began interviewing Barnes's friends, acquaintances, and the people he had seen in the days before his disappearance. Forensic work later established that Barnes died on or after Friday, June 22nd, which means he was held alive by his abductors for several days after climbing into the Holden. 2 days after the body was found, an anonymous caller contacted Adelaide police and named Bevan von Einem as the man responsible for Barnes's death. Police added Bevan's name to a list of secondary leads to work through after they had eliminated Barnes's closer social circle, but did not move on the tip immediately. A decision, with hindsight, would turn out to be catastrophic. About 2 months after Barnes's body was found, the second family victim disappeared. Neil Frederick Muir, aged 25, was a transient, heavily tattooed man living alone in a rented unit in central Adelaide. Neil was a substance user, widely reported to have been engaged in work around the Hindley Street nightclub to support his habit, and by 1979 was notorious in central city circles as someone who drifted between residences and was often intoxicated. On the evening of Monday, August 27th, he was drinking at the Mediterranean Hotel on Hindley Street when he became so heavily affected by a combination of drugs and alcohol that a bouncer physically dragged him out of the bar and tossed him on the sidewalk. Witnesses last saw him stumbling down the street alone. Within hours, he had been abducted, taken somewhere private, and killed. Early the following morning, 2 fishermen working on the Port River at Osborne spotted a black plastic garbage bag floating near Beach Road. When the bag was recovered and opened, it contained a human foot, and police rapidly located a second garbage bag tied off nearby, holding more of Neil's dismembered remains. Officials stated that his internal organs had been excised and replaced inside the hollowed abdominal cavity with his severed lower legs and forearms. Sections of tattooed skin had been deliberately removed, and his head had been tied to his torso by a rope threaded through his mouth and out through his neck. The pathologist determined that Neil died of massive blood loss via the same type of trauma that Barnes had suffered. The surgical precision of the dismemberment itself pointed investigators toward a killer with medical training. Despite having the same cause of death and trauma, investigators did not yet connect Neil and Barnes's cases. It was also around this time when Detective Rod Hunter finally got around to interviewing Bevan. Unprompted, Bevan asked about the Neil case. Hunter was surprised by this, but was unable to make any real moves with just that interaction alone. Ultimately, Bevan was released. Investigators pursuing Neil's killer received 2 separate phone calls from friends of his. They name-dropped a local medical practitioner, Dr. Peter Leslie Milhouse. According to them, he had a relationship with Neil and was seen with him in the days before his death. Detectives eventually served a search warrant on Dr. Milhouse's North Adelaide cottage and found the same type of black garbage bags and rope used to package Neil's remains, along with what appeared to be blood traces on a bathroom floor that had been repeatedly cleaned with a chemical agent strong enough to prevent forensic testing. The evidence was considered circumstantial but sufficient to charge Milhouse, and in 1980 he was tried for Neil's murder. Officials alleged that Milhouse had known Neil for a considerable period, had been seen with him in the days before his death, and that the surgical precision of the dismemberment pointed to a trained medical professional. In his own words, Milhouse's counter was that he was a, quote, totally inadequate surgeon. On October 9, 1980, a Supreme Court jury returned a unanimous verdict of not guilty, and Milhouse was acquitted of any involvement in Neil's death. His murder consequently reverted to unsolved status with an offer of a $200,000 reward for evidence to solve the case. Almost 2 years after Neil's last night out, the third victim was abducted in daylight on the opposite side of the city. His name was Peter Stogneff, and he was 14 years old. On Thursday, August 27, 1981, Peter chose to skip school for the day. Rather than going to Martin High School, he left home that morning and was last seen at the Tea Tree Plaza shopping center in Modbury, where he was seen in the company of an unidentified adult man. Peter never returned home. His parents reported him missing that same day. However, with little information or evidence, the investigation quickly stalled. On May 20th, 1982, a farmer clearing land near Middle Beach Road, approximately 50 kilometers north of Adelaide, set fire to boxthorn and scrub he had bulldozed out of the paddock. The fires burned for roughly 2 days, charring the debris and anything within it. About a month later, the farmer returned to the area he had cleared and found a human skull among the charred remains. He reported the discovery to police the following morning, and forensic examination quickly confirmed that the skeleton was Peter's. The remains had been cut into 3 pieces in a manner similar to that of Neil's, but the accidental burning had destroyed virtually all soft tissue, and with it any chance of determining cause of death, toxicology, assault evidence, or duration of captivity. Detectives now had 3 victims in 3 years. The common denominators in the cases were starting to become visible to investigators, but Peter's case provided so little forensic material that it did not immediately force the question of a serial offender. The 4th murder occurred before the discovery of Peter's remains, but after he had actually been killed. Mark Andrew Langley was 18 years old and, unlike the earlier victims, came from an apparently stable background. On the night of Saturday, February 27, 1982, Langley had gone out in central Adelaide and did not come home. His family reported him missing, and police began a search that quickly extended out of the city and into the Adelaide Hills. 9 days after his disappearance, Langley's body was discovered on the side of a road, concealed in blackberry bushes in scrub near Piccadilly in the remote Adelaide Hills. The autopsy yielded findings similar to the murders of Barnes and Neil. The feature that set Langley's body apart and that would profoundly alter investigators' thinking about the people behind the killings was an approximately 11-centimeter surgical incision running from Langley's navel to his pubic region. The skin around the wound had been shaved. The incision itself appeared to have been made with a genuine surgical instrument rather than an improvised knife, and the wound had been sutured shut and dressed with a bandage as if someone had attempted to close a legitimate operation. A section of Langley's small bowel was missing. The pathologist's most plausible explanation was that an object of some kind had been inserted into his body and then surgically removed. The final incident we'll discuss involves a 15-year-old boy named Richard Kelvin. By 1983, his life seemed to be going well. He had good grades at Adelaide High School, was well liked, and had recently gotten into what he described as a serious relationship with a girl. He even told his father how he wanted to propose to her when the two of them turned 19. On June 5, 1983, Richard had spent part of the afternoon at a park near the family home on Ward Street, kicking around a football with his father Rob and a friend named Boris. After a while, Rob walked home ahead of them, leaving the 2 boys at the park with the expectation that Richard would follow shortly for dinner. The boys continued at the park for a time before Boris decided he needed to head home himself. Rather than send his friend off alone, Richard walked Boris down to the O'Connell Street bus stop where the 2 waited at the stop together. As the bus came into view, Richard reportedly turned to Boris and said that he did not want to walk back alone, making a half-joking reference to the boys that had been going missing in the area. He made a similar comment about possibly getting mugged. Boris chuckled a bit and boarded the bus and left. Richard then turned back toward home. The distance from the stop back to Richard's house was said to be about 400 meters, yet he never made it back, as at approximately 6:15 p.m. he was abducted. However, no one saw the abduction itself. What the residents produced instead were descriptions of abrupt, alarming sounds. They noted that the sounds did not seem all that concerning at first and only began suspecting something after police reached out for questioning. The most detailed account came from a security guard who lived on Margaret Street, only a short distance from the bus stop. He described hearing a young voice cry out. He stated that on that same night, he couldn't tell what was being said, but given the context, he suspected that someone was asking for help. This was followed almost immediately by what sounded like a scuffle and car doors slamming in rapid succession. Then came the sound of a car with a particularly noisy, poorly maintained exhaust accelerating hard and speeding away down the street. The sequence was over within seconds. By the time the security guard looked out, the street was empty. Another resident also reported hearing a higher-pitched voice, possibly from a woman, alongside Richard's cries. These accounts led police to suspect a group of people over a single culprit. This is further bolstered when looking back at Barnes's case, who was described as being picked up in a car with 3 to 4 occupants. When Richard failed to appear for dinner that evening, his family assumed initially that he had stopped at a friend's house without calling. His parents waited, and by nightfall, it was clear he was not coming home. Rob and his wife began calling Richard's friends and receiving the same answer from each home. Nobody had seen him since he left the park with Boris. They reported him missing to police that same night. For the next 2 days, police treated the disappearance with a degree of caution that the Kelvin family later described as frustrating. The initial working hypothesis, as was common practice at the time, was that a teenager who did not come home might simply be a runaway. Richard's family vigorously contested this from the start, stating that his life was positive and he had no reason to throw it all away. It was only after receiving the previous mentioned accounts from other residents that the investigation was taken more seriously. With Richard still missing after 3 weeks, the investigation had generated significant media attention. This was largely part of the fact that his father was a major face on the Channel 9 nightly news. Furthermore, a full-page missing persons poster featuring Richard's photograph was also published on Adelaide's most popular newspaper called The Advertiser. Alongside the poster, the state government announced a reward of $5,000 for information leading to Richard's whereabouts, raised to $15,000 within the following week as calls continued to flood in. The poster generated hundreds of responses from the public. Police worked through every tip, but an unfortunate early development was that a false lead provided directed significant attention away from what the sound evidence had already indicated and toward entirely incorrect lines of investigation. On Sunday morning, July 24th, 7 weeks after Richard had last been seen, a geologist was walking with his family near a dirt airstrip at Kersbrook in the Adelaide Hills. He had brought his family to the area to search for moss-covered rocks. As they walked near the airstrip, they found Richard Kelvin's clothed body lying in the scrub. Richard was left in the fetal position. The autopsy returned a blood panel containing 5 distinct hypnotic substances, including mandrax, noctec, amytal, Valium, and rohypnol. Of those 5, mandrax stood out. In 1978, the Central Board of Health in South Australia had regulated mandrax as a Schedule 8 restricted substance, dramatically tightening the prescription regime and creating a paper record for every script written. The substance had become significantly less common on the street and in home medicine cabinets as a direct result. By 1983, the population of people with an active mandrax prescription in Adelaide was small enough to be tractable. Investigators immediately began a systematic sweep of the prescription records held by Adelaide pharmacists. Working through dispensary logs across the metropolitan area, they were looking for anyone who had recently been prescribed mandrax and whose name might connect to prior contacts in their files. The sweep took only days to produce a name. Among the mandrax prescriptions on record, police found one issued to a bevan, einem. The name was immediately familiar to several officers working the case. Bevan's name had previously come up on at least 3 separate occasions in police files by this point. It had been a name that orbited several investigations without ever becoming the focus of one until now. Detectives also quickly established another detail that deepened suspicion. The area where Richard's body had been found near the Kersbrook airstrip was close to an area where relatives of Bevan were known to live. 4 days after the body was found, 2 detectives drove to Bevan's home at 7 Day Street, Paradise. He was living there with his mother as he had for most of his adult life. He answered the door and was told that police wished to ask him questions in connection with the disappearance and death of Richard Kelvin. Bevan's first reaction was to say that he would not answer any questions without first speaking to his lawyer. For an innocent person with no knowledge of the crime, that instinct struck officers as alarming. Afterward, Bevan allowed the police to the house. He told investigators that on the night of June 5th, 1983, the night Richard was abducted, he had been at home sick in bed with influenza and had been off work for the following week. He said he had no knowledge of Richard's movements, had never met him, and had no involvement in his disappearance or death. Police then asked about drugs. Bevan acknowledged that he had mandrax in the house, explaining that he used it as a sleep aid to manage persistent insomnia. When police asked directly whether he kept any other sedative or hypnotic medications, Bevan said no. Officers then located a bottle of noctec on a ledge behind his wardrobe that was deliberately concealed. When confronted with the bottle, Bevan immediately became visibly nervous and offered that he rarely used it, a response that contradicted contradicted his just stated denial of having any other medications. When asked about the murder itself, Bevan said that he would not do such a thing because it would be unethical. Police regarded that choice of word as a red flag and expected a potentially innocent suspect to flat out deny the crime. Officials then collected blood and hair samples from Bevan as well as fiber samples from the carpet and other fabrics throughout the house. At the end of the day, Bevan had not been charged. Within days of the questioning, forensic teams began the work of comparing the material collected from the house against the evidence recovered from Richard's body and clothing. The eventual findings stated that 250 of the 925 collected fibers from the remains matched materials found in Bevan's home. In addition, Bevan's own hairs were found both on the exterior surface of Richard's clothing and inside it. When confronted with this information, Bevan's alibi about being sick changed. According to this revised alibi, Bevan said he had been driving along O'Connell Street on the evening of June 5th, searching for a parking spot so he could stop and buy food. As he turned into a side street, he said he nearly struck Richard, who was jogging across the road in front of him. Rather than driving off, Bevan claimed he stopped and struck up a conversation through the car window. In his telling, Richard willingly got into the car. Bevan claimed the two of them talked and that Richard opened up to him about problems he was experiencing, specifically being bullied at school. Bevan said he felt sympathy for the boy and drove him back to his home so they could continue talking somewhere comfortable. There, the two sat together on the bed and Richard also played his golden harp he kept nearby. Additionally, when Richard became visibly upset over the bullying, Bevan hugged him. After about 2 hours, he claimed he drove Richard back toward the city center, gave him $20 for a taxi, and dropped him off in the CBD. He said he never saw or heard from him again, and that whoever abducted and killed Richard must have done so after he dropped him off. But while the investigation was seemingly reaching a turning point, Bevan left the country. He claimed it was for a holiday, and before leaving, he sold his Ford Falcon. When asked when exactly he sold it, Bevan stated it was around July 16th, about 6 days after Richard's remains were found. Police did not have enough to arrest him before he left, and they could not lawfully stop him from traveling. So while he was in the Soviet Union and the UK, detectives began an intensive effort to locate the anonymous caller from 1979 who named Bevan as Alan Barnes's killer. They were able to successfully reach the caller and referred to him as Mr. B. According to Mr. B, he had personally accompanied Bevan on numerous occasions during the 1970s and into the early 1980s in which the two men had driven around Adelaide in Bevan's car, looking for young male hitchhikers willing to accept a ride. The victims were predominantly teenagers and young men in their early 20s, most of them making their way home late at night along suburban roads. Bevan's standard method, as Mr. B described it, was to invite the hitchhiker into the car and offer him alcohol, which was laced with hypnotic substances, the same sedatives prescribed for Bevan's insomnia. Once the sedative cocktail took effect, the young man was driven to Bevan's home, taken inside, and violated. By morning, according to Mr. B, the victim was typically still heavily sedated and was driven some distance from the house and left in a state too impaired to clearly recall what had happened. Mr. B insisted that he had never directly participated in a murder and had never been present when Bevan escalated beyond the assault pattern to the lethal violence that defined the family killings. His stated reason for coming forward was a combination of guilt and fear. Investigators accepted his account as credible enough to act on, while noting privately the complications his background and motivations would pose in court. Mr. B also provided names and identifying details of other men he knew to be associated with Bevan's circle. Bevan returned from overseas in early October 1983, and detectives moved in to arrest him on November 3rd of the same year. The trial began on October 15th, 1984 before Justice White, with a jury of 7 women and 5 men. The jury deliberated for about 8 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Bevan was sentenced to life imprisonment at Yatala Labor Prison with a 24-year non-parole period. Justice White described the crime as evidence of, quote, a cruel, bizarre, and long-standing imprisonment by deviants. It was only on March 24, 1988, when South Australian State Coroner Kevin A. Hearn ordered an inquest on the deaths of Barnes, Neal, Peter, and Langley, where it was concluded that the manner and circumstances of the 4 killings closely resembled those of Richard Kelvin, particularly in the Barnes and Langley cases. During a 1988 television interview, a detective spoke of the police having broken up the happy family that he believed was responsible for the killings. Journalists seized the phrase, and the label "the family" became the infamous moniker for the suspected network. Police identified a loose cluster of up to 12 men as persons of interest. Among the names most often reported were David Richmond, Robert Bland, and Stephen Woodards. David was a businessman, while Robert was a worker, and Stephen operated as a doctor. On an interesting side note, Robert Bland was actually outed as the man who called in the tip referred to as Mr. B. Initially, there was a court-imposed suppression order of his real name within South Australia. However, this only had real legal force within that particular jurisdiction. So when evidence was obtained, his real name began to surface in public newspapers elsewhere. On August 28, 1989, Bevan gave his first and only prison interview to the advertiser journalist Dick Wordley, in which he again denied involvement in the other killings. However, what he hinted at was that he could name other persons of interest, but feared for his life. By this time, the active reward on evidence solving the killings was raised to a cumulative $500,000. Shortly afterwards, police re-interviewed Mr. B, who was by then living in Sydney. He provided a fresh statement about Alan Barnes, strong enough that prosecutors were prepared to grant him immunity if Bevan were brought to trial. On September 15, 1989, Bevan was charged while in prison with Barnes's murder, and on November 10th with Langley's as well. Police lacked sufficient evidence to charge him in the remaining cases. However, the trial for these particular cases fell apart rather fast. In essence, Mr. B's credibility was brought into question, and the Attorney General believed the evidence provided by the prosecution was weak. The prosecution subsequently withdrew the Barnes and Langley charges in December. On January 29, 2006, it emerged that Bevan was under investigation for allegedly violating another inmate in prison. In October of that same year, it was reported he had been selling hand-painted greeting cards to prison officers at $20 each, leading to charges over commercial dealings from his cell. In June 2007, Bevan was charged again for possessing illegal material involving minors. On November 25, 2025, Bevan, then terminally ill with lung cancer, had been urgently transferred from Port Augusta Prison to the infirmary in a serious condition with only a short time to live. Detectives reportedly visited his deathbed in hopes of extracting information about the unsolved family murders. Bevan Spencer von Einem died in custody on December 5, 2025, at the age of 79. Premier Peter Malinauskas confirmed the death and lamented that he had offered no new information and had taken his secrets to the grave. Rewards of between $200,000 and $1 million remain on offer in each of the unsolved cases, with immunity still available for accomplices, and the investigation technically remains open. No other member of the alleged family network has ever been publicly identified through criminal conviction, and the full scope of the group, if it truly existed, is still debated by investigators.